Welcome back from the balcony. I hope you had a good cup of coffee. And now I'd like to turn, we've been focusing the first part of the morning on yourself, on getting yes to yourself. Now, how does that start to become getting yes to the other? That's what I want to focus on. And in particular, so I want to talk about the concept of reframing, but actually I think I'm going to ask you to participate in a 1-minute negotiation challenge, as it were. What I'd like you to do is to pick a partner at your table and stand up and face them. And if you can see, there are lines in the floor. So you're on one side and they're on the other side of the line, as if you're in conflict with each other, right? Just face them. You can even fold your arms if you'd like. But just pick a partner, if you wouldn't mind. Face them. And the challenge is, what I want you to do is I'm going to give you carte blanche to, your job is to persuade them to come over to your side of the line. And you can use any technique you would like, but just get them over on your side of the line. That's what we're trying to do in negotiation often, is we're trying to get the other side to come over to our position. And they're trying to get us to come over to their position. So find a line, be on opposite sides of the line, and just take a minute to see all the techniques you could use to try to persuade the other side to come to your side of the line. Okay, it just takes 1 minute. Just find a partner, stand up. I'm curious, how many of you were successful in persuading the other person to step over to your side of the line? Out of curiosity. Even in that very short period of time. So what were the techniques that you used to try to persuade them? What did you use? Reciprocity. So what did you do? You swapped. Okay. How many of you did that? How many of you just swapped? Okay. There's something key about that, because you swapped. In other words, you went to their side of the line and they came to your side of the line, right? So essentially, if you think about that, you took what was an either-or situation, either they come to your sideline or you come to, and you turned it into a kind of both and, right? Which is, to me, in some sense, the essence of successful negotiation is you listen to them, they listen to you. You try to address their interests, they try to address your interests, and so on. What other techniques did people use? What other things? Yes, please.
We started with the idea of each put a foot over the line.
You each put a foot over the line. Okay, so there was a little bit of, remember that distrust. So you're kind of like step by step.
Then we went to Edinburgh thinking about the Korea, North and South. But then we decided to handshake around the line, so we danced.
You danced. Okay. Okay. So you really turned it into a. That's interesting. And you mentioned that because it was interesting, as you saw when they were, President Moon and Chairman Kim were right there. Kim had a leader of North Korea had never stepped foot into South Korea, not in 70 years after this traumatic, terrible war. And they were right there on the line, and President Moon invites him over, and then they hold hands for a moment, they take things, and then apparently President Moon said, "Sometime I would like to visit the North." And so Kim said, "Well, why don't you do it right now?" And so they went over into the North, and then they came back into the South. And they did that exact same thing. It was kind of that reciprocity. It was that line. And in doing so, they began to erase a line that's been there, an artificial line that's been there for 70 years, that totally artificially divided one nation. It's been a nation for 5,000 years. And then this totally artificial line that was drawn just by some probably American military person back in 1945, just a totally artificial line to divide between where the Soviets were and where the Americans were, like the line in East and West Germany. And they began to erase it just by going across the line as if the line doesn't exist. exist. And that to me is kind of the essence, that maybe the most powerful thing you can do in a negotiation is that ability to, the power you have to reframe the situation from an either or. We're both locked into opposed positions. It's either my way or your way, my position or your position, into, can we reframe this into both and? Is there some way to address your interests and address my interests and address the third party's interests and so on? So it's all about that underlying shift in mindset. And that to me was the key thing in that summit, was it shifted the mindset. And I saw it in the polls, because I've been working hard on the Korea situation now for almost a year, and it was a shift. It was a psychological shift of they've grown up on both sides to see each other as enemies, and suddenly there was this shift that you cross the line, you break just a simple line with a simple step, and then back and forth there was that improvised moment that brought humor. There was a little bit of humor. I could hear people laugh when suddenly they went to the other side, they went to the north, and then they went to the south. To realize it's in the end an artificial line. I mean, I think it was Einstein who once said, he talked about the most persistent delusion of humanity is this delusion that we are somehow separate. Scientifically we know this, spiritually we know this. But, as an anthropologist, I know, there's not two humanities, there's not three humanities, there's only one humanity. And somehow, but we have it in our mind that we're all these little separate individuals. And out of that notion of separation, obviously springs the notion of scarcity, that there isn't enough. And out of the notion of scarcity, obviously breeds all the conflicts that we see in the world. But it all goes back to something in our mindset that we are these separate little beings, when scientifically we know it's not true. Anthropologically we know it's not true. All the wisdom traditions of the world show us, but somehow it's a persistent delusion. And those moments when that delusion can be shifted turn out to be key. So to me, as we know in negotiation, mediation, we know the importance of changing the game, the way you change from a win-lose contest to something where all sides can benefit, so-called win-win. And as I said the other day in the Scottish Parliament, it's no longer enough for just win-win. We need to add a third win, which is a win for the larger community, a win, because that's what's happening in the world today. There are win-win solutions in globalization, corporations and so on, but they leave out key players. They leave out key communities. There are people who feel excluded, who feel left behind by the process of globalization. I believe, as I travel the world, that's what's behind a phenomenon like Brexit. That's what's behind a phenomenon like in Colombia, after 5 years of painstaking negotiation on a peace agreement, there was a plebiscite, there was a referendum, and by a fraction, it was 50.003%, the peace agreement was voted down, which was to the shock and surprise of everyone. But it was because there were people who felt left out, who felt left behind, who weren't included in the process. So much of negotiation is we focus on the people who are at the table, but we forget the people who are not at the table. And that turns out to be key. And so that ability to reframe from win-lose to win-win-win is the key, but it's hard to do. It's hard to do. Because it's so persistent, the illusion that we're somehow separate. And so that's where it comes from, is that this ability to reframe, the ability to reframe in negotiations. Why is it so difficult? I believe it's difficult because, again, there's an inner, it's like that iceberg, there's an inner root to it, which goes back to, if reframing is one of our greatest powers, which essentially is the ability to move the spotlight away from positions. It's almost like a negotiation takes place here on a stage. The spotlight can even be on the positions. Like with my friend Abilio, the position was he wanted $1 billion, he wanted the company headquarters or whatever. It's the ability to move the spotlight over here to what was that? Yeah, there we go. Yes, focus. Interests on what are the underlying interests? What do people really want? How does he get his freedom? How does he get his, where are the creative options? What are objective criteria for deciding what's fair? The ability to move that spotlight is the ability to reframe. The way you change the game is you change the frame. And that is our own ability. That's what you were doing for a moment. You were changing the frame. And that ability is this ability to change the mindset. And again, it comes from inside. It's not something from outside that needs to shift. And in this world today, what I find is that increasingly the logic, whether it's the logic of politics or the logic of war or whatever, is that increasingly those who think that you can win simply at the expense of the other you end up with lose-lose outcomes. And not just lose-lose outcomes, lose-lose-lose outcomes. I think, it was Voltaire who once said, I was ruined twice. Once when I lost a lawsuit, and once when I won a lawsuit. But it's true today, even much more so. I mean, it's hard to imagine the situation where people actually win wars anymore. It's like in Colombia, for example, all sides were losing, and then it takes some time. Where Northern Ireland, for example, just across the water here, for the longest time, both sides were fighting. They finally realized no one is winning, and both sides are losing. But what's worse is the third loss was the whole community was losing. The community of Ireland and the surrounding community was losing. And then they begin to realize that maybe there's a glimmer of a possibility of arriving at a solution where all sides can somehow win together at the negotiating table. Same thing took place in South Africa. I remember being there during that time, just before Mandela was released, and afterwards, and it was the same thing. There was this dawning realization that no one was going to win. It's almost like, okay, no one can win this thing. We're all losing. And then they don't think that there's a win-win possibility, but then gradually they realize that there is a way that everybody can win from the situation. And that's the art. That's the challenge in negotiation. But how do we do that if we don't shift our own inner mindset first? That's the key to me. The key is that shift in our own inner mindset. And to me, it goes back to this ability to reframe the picture from scarcity, because that's really what is at the root of so much conflict. Is there's not enough power, there's not enough resources, there's not enough recognition. Somehow we have to move from a condition of scarcity to a condition of sufficiency. And essentially I think it was actually Einstein who put it so well right after the end of the Second World War. The famous physicist, right after Hiroshima and Nagasaki were in some ways the result of the breakthroughs in nuclear physics that he was part of, he said, he came to the conclusion that, that the most important question anyone could ask themselves, the most important question anyone could ask themselves was this one, is the universe a friendly place? He asked himself that question because he realized that that's not something anyone can determine objectively. It's something subjective inside of ourselves. It's a choice that we make. But if we assume that the world is an unfriendly place, then he was assured that nations then would arm themselves to the teeth, and we would end up with nuclear weapons. We'd end up destroying life on Earth. So somehow the shift is to look inside of ourselves and check our own assumptions about, is the universe a friendly place or not? And that's behind, to me, that's the underlying assumption. Einstein's question is behind the underlying assumption that then allows us to make the shift from, is this a win-lose universe where the only way I can win is at the expense of someone else? Or is there a possibility that there can be benefit for all? And I've seen that happen. I mean, I've seen that happen so many times. I saw that happen in South Africa, as I mentioned, in Northern Ireland. I saw that in the Cold War. I worked for many years on the Cold War. The United States, my country, probably spent $1 trillion trying to find a way to win a nuclear war. $1 trillion, the best brains on earth, $1 trillion, I think, and no one could figure out a way to win a nuclear war. The only way you could do it was everyone would lose. Everyone would lose. And for the last year, I've been working on Korea because of the same thing. Because essentially, here was, the more I looked into it, here was the prospect of an existential threat again to millions of people. There were experts extremely close to the situation who estimated the chances of war as high as 50% or even higher. Of a war in which, I don't know if any of you have been to Korea and Seoul, but the capital of Korea, which I just visited a few weeks ago, is 30 miles from the border. There are thousands of artillery guns aimed at it, and a city of 10 million, actually a metropolitan area of 25 million people, could just be demolished. Not to speak of the first use of nuclear weapons or chemical weapons or biological weapons since World War II, the largest events since World War II. And everyone would lose. Everyone would lose. The world would go into a worldwide recession, and we were coming that close. And thank God, there was, by some act of divine grace, the Olympics, which had been scheduled a long time ago, were scheduled in this peninsula, which is the most heavily militarized border in the world, with millions of troops facing each other on each side, with China, Russia, Japan, the United States, all the great powers right there focused on this one place. And the Olympics was like a collective balcony. It was like, oh, the world can somehow have a contest of grace and beauty and a celebration of human potential. And that actually created a kind of cooling off period, a kind of a balcony period where instead of fire and fury and all these tweets and threats and I've got a bigger button than you do, to suddenly, okay, maybe the possibility of dialogue, the possibility of respect, the possibility of an opening, a little bit of a breathing space that led to that meeting where they switched sides, which is the beginning. It's not, we have a long process ahead of us. There is still a summit, a very important summit going to take place between the United States and North Korea a month from now. But but we're in a slightly different place. There was a reframe, a collective reframe, thanks to the ability to go to the balcony, thanks to some beginning of a shift there. And that's the key, because there was so much enmity, so much focus on the unfriendliness of the other. And then suddenly things begin to shift, and you begin to realize that people could see that there's some shared humanity there, some common humanity, and that's the beginning of a way forward in that situation. So what I'd like to do in this moment is bring up on the stage on a personal level the person who has perhaps taught me this lesson most personally and most viscerally is my own daughter, Gabriella, and her life story, Gabi. Sorry, Gabi. Oh, you're Gabriella, but Gabi. And I'd like for a moment just to invite you up to the stage here to tell us a little bit about the story, because she, perhaps more than anyone else, has personified for me in a very family, very personal way, as a father, this kind of seeing the world, whether you choose the world to see the world as friendly or unfriendly, because she had every reason to see the world as unfriendly, and she chose the other one. So please, Gabby.
by most people's standards, there's quite a lot wrong with me, but I see it differently, and I think that's made all the difference in my life. Up until the day I was born, my parents were expecting a perfectly normal baby girl. Then I popped out. No one, not even the doctors, realized that I was one of the 1 in 40,000 babies born with Batter syndrome. And it affects everyone differently, but for me individually, it affected my spine, my spinal cord, legs, feet, and a number of my organs, which is a lot of problems for a tiny baby. In order to fix all of those problems, I underwent about 15 major surgeries, casts on both my legs and my back for about 9 years. Physical therapy every single day for years, literally hundreds and hundreds of doctor's appointments. And as hard as that part of my life was, my day-to-day life was pretty normal. I would go to school, play with my friends, go to PE. I never let the fact that things were harder for me get in my way. The way I saw it was that complaining about my situation wasn't going to help, so what was the point? I didn't care that I was smaller, couldn't run as fast as any of my friends, and neither did they. The only thing I saw that was wrong was when people thought I couldn't do something. And ever since I was little, I've been obsessed with being the best at something, and I would get the Guinness World Record books every year. And as soon as I found out that it was pretty easy to apply for one, I started doing it a lot. I started off with easier ones. Granted, I didn't actually complete any of them. I think the first one was most socks on 1 foot. I went around the entire house, collected all my brother's socks, got I think 60 or 70 socks on my left foot. And then it was longest hopscotch course, my driveway with a friend of mine, just like spiraled around. And I always had this sort of in the back of my mind, but it wasn't something, I really acted on up until my sophomore year, which is the second year in high school in the States, when I tried out for my school's volleyball team. I signed up because I thought there wasn't going to be any running. But the first day I got there, my school has this huge hill, and the first thing they told us was you have to run up and down it. And I explained to my coach that I wasn't able to because I didn't have any calf muscles. And for really speaking honestly, I really don't like running either. So she told me to get down on the ground and do the plank, which is an exercise that most people do in yoga, or we have to do it in gym class quite often. And while all my friends ran up and down, I was there on in the grass doing this plank, and when they all returned, it had been 12 minutes. And when I saw everyone's surprise and realized that this was not a normal thing for someone to just do, I instantly thought of Guinness World Records. So I went home and looked up the record. It was 40 minutes, 1 second. At the time, it was held by a woman in Indiana. And I applied for the record, and about 6 weeks later, I got back this huge pile of paperwork stating all the rules and things like that I would have to submit if I actually wanted to do this. And then I had surgery, I think, over Thanksgiving break in November, and I spent a few weeks recovering. But when I came back to school in January, I decided I was really going to try for this. So I would come home every day and lie on the ground of our living room or in my room and play. The goal on my first day was 20 minutes, then 25, 27, and so on and so forth. My dog was especially happy with this because I think she knew in her heart that I couldn't move, so she took this as her opportunity to mess with me as much as she could. I made it my goal for my 16th birthday in April that I would break the record. And as the day got closer, I wanted to use this opportunity as a way to raise money for a cause that was very close to my heart, which is the Children's Hospital of Colorado, which I had most of my surgeries and spent quite a bit of time when I was younger there. I wanted to help a specific program for kids with special needs so that they could help other kids like me, because I honestly think that without the doctors and nurses there, I probably wouldn't be able to do a plank maybe, and let alone try and break the world record. So finally, the day of the event came. I had set up a website with the initial stretch target of $5,000, and little did I know at that point that I think now it's been 4 years. But now I raised more than 20,000 or 20 times that amount. And finally, the day of record came. It was 2 days after my 16th birthday. It was technically my birthday party. I don't know how fun it was for me, but and I had practiced every day before my bedroom, but I had mostly been alone, with the exception of my dog, because my mom said it was too painful to watch me do this. So something I hadn't expected happened. I had my phone in between my arms, you can sort of see in the corner of the photo, to help distract me. But with all of my friends and family there, and sort of the pressure building, everything started to hurt around 30 minutes, which was nowhere close to where I wanted to be. My arms were shaking, everything was hurting my back, was in a lot of pain. And then my mom asked my friends to come over. There's not a picture, but my friends come over and sit by the side, and they tried to help distract me, because obviously no one could touch me or interfere with anything. So they would tell me funny stories and sing songs. My friend Leah's inspirational quote of the day was, "If you're not cheating, you're not trying." So after that, I started to have a lot more fun, and time went by much more quickly, and soon I passed an hour. I decided at 1 hour and 20 I would go down, which I wanted to end on an even number, but I didn't realize at that moment that it was exactly, down to the second, double the record I had been initially going for. So this was, my birthday. This was my 16th birthday cake. Reflecting back on it all, I think the thing that truly made a difference in my life was the way people treated me and the way I looked at life. No one ever treated me like I was different, and my parents always let me try basically anything I wanted. My mom even let me go to Thailand alone for 2 weeks, and she researched every hospital within a 50-mile radius of where I was going, but she still let me go. And I think if that wasn't the case, I probably wouldn't have tried out for volleyball, which is, for being realistic, is a tall person's sport. And without that, I wouldn't have planked. I wouldn't have broken the Guinness World Record, and I wouldn't be here speaking to you today. And without my special needs, I would have run the mile and probably been at home watching Netflix right now. As for my friends, they could not care less. In fact, I think they kind of enjoy it, because when we go to music parks, we don't have to wait in line, so I'm a very popular choice. But the truth is, if you can take anything away from this, is that you really shouldn't underestimate others because of a difference, because you have no idea how that'll impact their life later, but more importantly, don't underestimate yourself, because you might not try something that you're 99% sure you're going to be terrible at, which might turn into something amazing. And one of my favorite quotes is, as Audrey Hepburn once said, "Nothing is impossible. The word itself says, I am possible." Thank you.
So that's the story of what the power of reframing, Gabby had every reason to see the world as unfriendly, and she chose to see the world as friendly, as a place where she could do something. And I've seen that true in negotiation. I'll just give you one other example. At the very beginning of the Colombian peace process, when I was involved, one of the challenges was there was a lot of political opposition within the country to even trying to achieve peace. There were a lot of people who would oppose it, so it had to be done extremely secretly. There were probably only a dozen people who actually knew about it, not the army, not the intelligence services, just the president, a handful of people around him, to be able to conduct negotiations with the guerrillas to see if they were serious before the negotiations would be announced publicly. And so one of the challenges that we faced was how to extricate a guerrilla commander out of the jungle of Colombia to a place where we could negotiate, a safe place, which was in Havana. And so a government official whom I knew at the time was close to, his name was Jaime, and it all goes back to things you were saying about distrust. There was so much distrust. The guerrillas wouldn't tell, of course, the government where they were located because they were afraid that if they did, there would be a military strike on that place. So he couldn't use a military helicopter. He rented a private helicopter. A Red Cross official got into the helicopter and a Cuban official. And the Cuban official handed the pilot the coordinates for where to go in the jungle to land to find this guerrilla commander, whose name was El Medico. And they flew out, whatever, half an hour, 40 minutes into the jungle, landed in a clearing, and minutes later, hundreds of guerrillas started coming out of the jungle, surrounding the helicopter, each one pointing an AK-47 at the helicopter. So Jaime had every reason in that moment to feel the world was a very unfriendly place. And he was wondering what to do, but it had the presence of mind to go to the balcony at that moment, realize that the helicopter walls would not protect him from all this. So he decided he might as well open the helicopter door and go out. And he strode up to the guerrilla commander who was there, and it was kind of pandemonium, and the guerrillas were saying, "Don't you get in this helicopter? It's a trick. They're gonna kill you. They're gonna take you to prison. They're gonna dump you in the sea and whatever." There was a lot of pandemonium going on, and he had the presence of mind from the balcony to go up to the commander and say, "Señor Comandante, I am now placing you under the personal protection of the president," which was a reframe. I mean, he, with all these guns aimed at him, is putting this fellow under the personal protection. And that's a reframe from seeing the other side as an enemy to recognizing that we are together in this, that I'm putting you under the personal protection of the president, inviting them to the helicopter. We've been bitter enemies, but we are now potential partners to collaborate, to work together towards peace. And El Medico looked at him for a moment. Everyone was saying, "Don't do it," and he decided to get in. By trusting, Jaime trusted his life, he took a risk, and then El Medico took the risk of getting in the helicopter. The helicopter flew off to Venezuela, then got a private plane, went off to Havana, and in Havana they had 4 months of intense secret negotiations, unbeknownst to anyone in Colombia, reached a framework agreement, an agenda that was sufficient that the president could announce it and then begin the formal negotiations, which took another 4 or 5 years. But it all starts in that moment, as you mentioned, of how do you build trust among enemies? How do you reframe the situation? How do you change that situation? I remember asking Jaime about it. He had a certain faith that somehow, from his own, personal faith, that the universe was a friendly place. And it's that inner decision to see the world as friendly that allows us then to begin to shift the external relationships, to build that trust that is so necessary to begin to transform these situations. So for me, again, the key ability in negotiation, which is what we try to do, which is to change situations from ones that are seen as win-lose situations to things that are seen as win-win-win situations. The key starts again within. That's why getting the yes within is so key. It's why it's so important to begin by going to the balcony. Begin by keeping our eyes on the prize. Begin by knowing our inner battle. That then allows us to reframe. So essentially asking ourselves again that question, going back to your own situations for a moment, thinking about, okay, where does your essential satisfaction come from? Because that's, after all, what we're trying to do in negotiate. We're negotiating in order to build our own sense of satisfaction. What you came up with was confidence, security, stability. Where does that all come from? Where does it all come from in the end, if it can come from within, from a place from within, there's a place of enoughness within that then can translate into the scarcity, the perceived scarcity that there is in the world. And so I find that inner work, of that inner choice to be able to see life somehow in our own favor. I remember my father-in-law, when he was dying, he would have these kind of, be sort of balanced between kind of having sort of hellish visions and heavenish visions. But at one point, he said, just a few days before he died, he said, now I see, he said, all my life, I've been thinking that somehow life was against me. And now I see that life was always actually in my favor. And it's that shift that we need inside of ourselves that actually can help us when it comes to dealing with the most difficult situations that we face. If we can do that own inner work inside of ourselves, then based on that inner yes, we can then reframe. We can move that spotlight from interests, from positions to interests, from positions to options for mutual gain, from positions to objective criteria. So again, the process of getting to yes with ourselves, I find that in the most difficult situations that I'm dealing with, that getting to yes with myself turns out about the key to being able to get a yes with others. So the ability to go to the balcony is actually, that's the foundation of the ability to reframe, because from the balcony you can see things differently. And that brings us to the fifth point, which is having, which is, to me, as I mentioned, in negotiation, you're trying to, the key thing to do is to be able to put ourselves in the shoes of the other. It's to be able to listen to the other. But in difficult situations, that is extremely hard for people. It is extremely hard for us to listen to others in difficult situations. Even in easy situations, it's hard for us to listen to situations. So the ability to, why is it so hard to listen? I think in today's world, I mean, with everything that's going on with social media, tweeting and texting and cell phones, someone's trying to talk. I was, last week, I was facilitating a meeting of the leaders of the Venezuelan opposition. Venezuela, as you may know, is going through a terrible time right now. The country is imploding. There's not enough food. There's not enough medicine. Vast numbers of children are undernourished. There are refugees fleeing from Venezuela by the tens of thousands every day. There are over 3 or 4 million refugees fleeing from that country. This is one of the wealthiest countries in the world. It has the largest proven oil reserves in the world, and it is imploding. They're flooding into Colombia. There are over 1 million refugees in Colombia alone. And anyway, I was meeting with the Venezuelan opposition because there's about to be a fraudulent presidential election next week. And the question was how to respond to that situation. And I noticed there's 30 people from civil society, from the church, from universities, from the political parties, dissident Chavistas, followers of President Chavez. They're having this wide thing. We're in the room. And I noticed when everyone's talking, everyone else is on their cell phones. And, so it's like there's, in this world now, we live in this communications revolution, and everyone is talking and we're receiving all this. But who is listening? Who is truly, truly listening? And that's what I find to be one of the biggest barriers today in the world, is where is that listening taking place? Because essentially what's happening is, the reason it's so hard for us to listen to others is there's so much going on inside of us that we don't have the space, we don't have the mental, we don't have the emotional space to really take in the other. And by listening, I don't just mean hearing the words of the other side. I don't mean just hearing what they're saying, I mean hearing what they're not saying. That's what's the key. hearing what they're not saying, hearing what's behind it, where are they actually coming from. It's kind of a lost art, and I feel like this is a time for, it's interesting to me that our children, we teach them arithmetic, we teach them English, we teach them everything, but we don't teach them how to listen. And yet that may be the core skill for social emotional intelligence, the ability to listen. Not just to listen as we usually do, which is we listen from within our frame of reference. So we're there, we're saying, I agree with that person, I disagree with that person, there's this little voice going on. The key is to be able to listen from within the other side's frame of reference. That's true listening. How do you actually put yourself in their shoes and understand how they're seeing things? I remember once, a few years ago, I was so perturbed by what was going on in Syria that I organized a little project of listening, where, because Syrians weren't talking to each other, a group of colleagues and I decided to interview Syrians from all sides of the situation, and then let each other know what the other side was thinking. What were their interests? What did they really care about? We came, and the war was raging, so we at one point we set up shop right on the Syrian border, just about a mile from the Syrian border, the southern Turkish town. And these Syrian rebel commanders or mayors or whatever would come over the border and would talk with us. And one thing they said was, wow, no one's listening to us. That was one thing they said was, you're the first people to come listen to us. And we would talk to them for 3 or 4 hours. And I remember we did this for a full week that one time. And the last person to come in was a rebel commander. I remember just watching my own preconceptions. He came in, and these were people who were literally stepping out of hell. Just really stepping out of hell and going right back into hell. And this is a fellow who commanded 2,000 men. And he was young, I would say. He wasn't older than 30. Had the beard. He looked exactly like our Western stereotype of a terrorist. He said he was a fundamentalist and believed in Sharia law, and it was just very. So it's just I could just watch. So then I just was questioning him, and I said to him, so how did you get involved in the fighting? That's what we were asking him. Where did it all start? How did you get involved? He said, well, I was in university. And I said, so what were you studying in university? I was studying poetry. And so that was the kind of first thing. Okay, so he's a poet. And then he recited some beautiful Arabic poetry, which was gorgeous. And he said, in fact, I won the National Poetry Prize. And I was wondering how a poet, would become like, what's the psychological process? And with every one of the people we interviewed about 20 or 30 people that week. To a person, they'd all gone through torture. I mean, they'd all been tortured. And he had written a poem when he was 15 that had made some elusive reference that was critical of the regime, and he had gone to prison for it. And then I just kept on asking him questions, and I said to him, if you survive this war, what do you hope to do? What do you hope to do with your life? He said, well, I fell in love with a young woman from Egypt. I'm hoping that I'll, be able to get together with her and we'll get married. And, I could watch my own stereotypes start to dissolve as this kind of human being began to emerge in front of me. And then I said to him, so what are you most afraid of for your country? Let's imagine you win. Maybe the rebel side wins. What are you most afraid of? He said, I'm afraid of the extremists. And I said, you're afraid of the extremists? Yeah. He said, no, because I believe in all of this. He said, but I don't want to impose on it by violence, by will on people. Anyway, the last thing I asked him was there any message that he wanted to bring back to people in the West? And he said to me, yes, he said, He said, you know, on your televisions, he said, you know, we show up as just numbers and so on. He said, please tell people in the West that every one of us, every man, woman, and child has a soul. Please give them that message. And so I could just watch, you know, it's just being able to put myself in his shoes, see the world through a frame of reference. I may not agree with him, but the ability to really understand where he was coming from, that's the key to me, is this ability to listen turns out to be key. And it's because it conveys a kind of respect, which turns out to be key, is the ability to listen to what's not said, the ability to listen to the underlying feelings, the underlying needs of the other, no matter who they are, no matter how much you may disapprove of their behavior. That, to me, is the key in negotiation, is we tend to give respect to people we think feel deserve our respect. But to me, the key in all of these things is to respect even if the other side doesn't seem to deserve them. Because what happens is we get into the cycle and we reject the other side, they reject us. The only way around that is to give them basic human respect, which is a birthright, that everyone deserves that basic human respect. What does respect mean? It comes from Latin, respect, to look again. Respect is inspectable, so look again and see a human being there. And that respect then turns into respect. That's what we saw between Kim and Moon a few weeks ago. That's the kind of the condition, the essential condition I find for success here is to do that. And it's not easy. It's not easy, but that basic, I find that in negotiation, the cheapest concession you could make is to give the other side some respect. And that's the key. And where does that come from? That comes from being able to respect yourself first. You cannot give the other side respect unless you respect yourself first. You cannot put yourself in the other side's shoes unless you put yourself in your shoes. And that all comes back to the balcony again. It's yesterday I was remembering somehow being here in Scotland. I remembering when I was 5 or 6, my mother loved poetry, and her favorite poet perhaps was Robert Burns. And she would cite a few lines, and there was one line I always remembered, which was, the best laid plans of mice and men gain off the glade. And I looked up the poem, and what it is, it's an ode of compassion, an ode of empathy. He was plowing his field, as you well know, and he disturbed a mouse's nest. And so he was putting himself in the shoes of this mouse. He was the strong one, the mouse was the weak one. He was apologizing to this mouse. And to me, that's, those lessons of what Adam Smith actually called, in his theory of moral sentiments, he called it sympathy. It's empathy, that ability. You don't necessarily have to agree with the other, you don't have to approve of their behavior or whatever, but the ability to empathize, to me, is key. And it starts with the ability to empathize for yourself. With self-compassion, then you can be compassionate for the other side. And it's interesting, even like hardened, trained, as I mentioned, hardened hostage negotiators, like New York kind of burly cops and whatever. And I said, so what's the secret that you use with these hostage negotiations? And they say, I remember this big burly New York policeman, he said, well, what I learned was be nice. That's it. You give respect. You may disagree with that person, or they're a criminal, I don't know, they're holding someone hostage, but the only way into that mind is giving them some elementary respect. That's the only way you can begin to influence them to release that hostage safely. And that turns out to be the key. So last point here in the balcony-based negotiation is, on the basis of all that, then, how do you've got to reach a good agreement, but it's hard to do that. It's hard. The key to me in negotiation is this ability to build the other side a golden bridge, which comes from the Chinese strategist Sun Tzu as 2,500 years ago. It's like your mind is here, and their mind may be way over here, and you're over here. You're saying, "Hey, come on over to my position. This is where you should be." But in fact, if we go to the balcony for a moment, if we put ourselves in their shoes and start where they are and look at what we're asking them to do, there's like a giant chasm in between the two. It's like that chasm is full of doubt, anxiety, unmet needs. I'm going to look like a failure. I'm going to look weak to my constituency. So it's very hard to do this, but essentially what successful negotiation requires, particularly in difficult situations, is the ability for a moment to leave where our mind is, where our thinking is, where we believe we're right, where our values are, and start the conversation over here where the other side is, and then proceed to build them a golden bridge over that chasm, to make it as easy as possible for them to move in the direction we want them to move. Instead of pushing them, that's what we tend to do, is we push, we pressure. But of course, the more we pressure, the more we push, what do? They push back. So it's the art of attracting them in the direction we want them to go. And that, to me, is the key. That's in Colombia, if I may just give an example. When I first met with the government delegation, with the president's older brother and the negotiators, the first thing I did, and this is an exercise I kind of recommend in any difficult situation you could apply to your own situation right now, is I asked them to write the other side's victory speech. So in this case, I asked the government, the older brother of the president, to think about what the victory speech of the rebel commander would be if they agreed to lay down their weapons, if they agreed to make peace. How are they going to give a victory speech to their troops and explain why after 50 years they're laying down their weapons? And of course he was a little bit shy at first, but then I had to come up there and say, okay, I'm the comandante, and this is why, we fought for 50 years, we fought an honorable fight, we got some social justice, we got the right, and you start from that victory speech. In other words, you start from the end and you work backwards, particularly in a difficult situation like the ones you all face. Imagine for a moment, go put yourself through this thought experiment. Imagine for a moment that you start from where their thinking is, you make it attractive. Imagine you help write their victory speech. Essentially what is, imagine they say yes to your proposal. Take your own situation for a moment. Do this thought experiment. Imagine the other side says yes to your proposal. They say they're going to do what you want them to do. Now, how could they sell this to their constituents? What could they say to the people that they care about, whom they have to explain why they're going to agree with this? If you're the Scottish government and you're dealing with Theresa May, how should they sell this to her constituents? How are you going to do that? What could you say? What would be your key talking points? And this, like in Korea, when I began working in Korea a year ago, when they were just killing each other, I actually photoshopped an image of these three leaders all meeting there together and shaking hands, and people laughed. They was thinking, but I've taken that picture around to the White House. I've taken it to South Korea, to the top ministers there, and suddenly when people imagine, that's the victory, that's the thing, then they start pointing at it and they start talking about it, and it implants something in their imagination. It's the victory speech. So more than a year ago, when I began working in Korea, I began with the victory speech. What was Donald Trump's victory speech? He's got to be able to say, I've made America safe again. This is the deal of the century. I was able to do what Obama wasn't able to do. I was able to do what Bush wasn't able to do. You know, this is the biggest deal ever, and it won't cost us a penny. He's got to be able to say something like that. And if you take his opponent, Kim Jong-un, he's got to be able to say, our country is safe, you know, the regime is safe, the family is safe, you know, our economy is going to grow and prosper. We finally have the respect we deserve after being stigmatized and excluded. You know, I completed my father and grandfather's dream. You write those victory speeches, and then you think, okay, how do we get to a point where we do that? And that, to me, is the key in negotiation. So what I invite you to do that for your own situation for a moment. Think through, what is the victory speech? The victory speech you could give, but also, very importantly, what's the other side's victory speech? How do you make it easier for them to give that victory speech? How do we do that? You take that as the challenge. That's the essence of building the other side of Golden Bridge, is to write that victory speech. So think about who their constituency is, what are the key themes of that speech, what are the most likely criticisms they're going to get, what are the best responses they could make, and that's it. So it all starts with a win inside of us, which then can lead to a win for both parties, but ultimately ends up with a win for the larger society, for the larger whole. So that's really the process of getting to yes with yourselves. If I could just end for a moment, because it's time for, I notice, for lunch, is there's a quote I've always liked from a poet, not such a well-known poet, it was an American poet who lived in the 1930s during the Depression. And his name was Edward Markham. And there's a line in this poem that to me really talks to the great challenge that we face today, is in the world today there are so many people who are feeling so frightened by the process of globalization, by everything that's going on. We're retreating into our tribes, and so we're excluding others, and then of course we exclude the excluders. And Edward Markham had a poem where he wrote, "They drew a circle." And it's interesting. I heard this poem actually quoted by a man who heard it from the poet himself. The poet himself had a shock of white hair. I think he might even have come to Oxford at some point or whatever, but it was, he heard this poet at a small rural school in rural Tennessee in the back in the 30s. This gentleman I know is now over 100. Anyway, he remembers hearing the poet declaim this line. And the line was, "They drew a circle and shut me out, a rebel, a heretic, a thing to flout. But love and I had the wit to win. We drew a circle," and he drew a huge circle. "We drew a circle and took them in." To me, that's the key. The key is somehow in this world where there's so much exclusion going on, we have to learn to draw that wider circle of inclusion. And that starts within. That starts within us by getting to yes within ourselves in order to get to yes with others. Thank you very much.
All I would say, William, is you have drawn a very fine and wide circle to embrace us all this morning. What other learning, what other wisdom, and what a lot to go away and think about and to apply. And either now or at the end of the day, there are a couple of questions at the end about what you are going to do specifically, the what, the how, and the when, to address the difficult situations that you identified at the start of the morning, apply all the richness and the wisdom which those of you have shared with us this morning. And there's a final question at the end, which is to whom are you going to be accountable? Because it's easy for us to commit to ourselves internally as we get to ourselves, and within ourselves. Sometimes it takes somebody on the journey to guide you and support We're going to have lunch shortly. We've got lunch through until 1:45. Well, I really would like those to have us all seated back here at 1:45 rather than a journey from wherever we may be to come back. Lunch will be set up upstairs in the balcony, and there are some tables and chairs down the side as well. I think it's probably easier to stay up there rather than bring everything down here. It's entirely up to you. Largely standing, there are places to sit. There are going to be books for sale. I'm told that there has been a delay in the delivery of Getting to Yes With Yourself, but it's on its way, and it should be here very shortly. Dear Miriam from the office, to whom many thanks are due along with Ainsley, Fiona and others to help make this work so well. Ainsley says she got back to her house where she has 13 copies of the book, and she's going to bring it in. They'll be Getting to Yes as well, and also The Power of a Positive No, which is a book about which you spoke back in 2009. I'm going to make a suggestion. A number of you have already come up and asked William to sign your books. If you are going to do that, and if William is gracious enough to do that at say 1:30, how about a small donation? We'll put a box out there which can go towards Gabby's good cause